Hey everybody, I'm Emily Sweeney from the Boston Globe and the New England First Amendment Coalition, and I want to thank you all for joining us for this episode of Three Requests, Three Stories. This webinar is part of NEFAC's ongoing series on New England state public records laws. You can check out our previous episodes on the New England First Amendment Coalition's YouTube channel, or check out our amazing Freedom of Information guide at nefac.org. This video series that we're doing is brought to you by NEFAC with support from the Society of Professional Journalists Foundation, MuckRock, SPJ New England, and the New England Society of News Editors. And leading today's session, we have Liam Elder Connors. Liam is a reporter for Vermont Public Radio, and he focuses on criminal justice, poverty, and politics. So Liam, I want to thank you so much for joining us.
Yeah, thanks for having me. It's great to be here. So I thought I'd start off just with a little bit about Vermont's public record law right out of the statute. And, basically Vermont's public record law, I really like rereading it every once in a while. It's just a good reminder about sort of what's in it. And also, it's just, I think, a nice little bit of reading. Officers of the government are trustees and servants of the people, and it is in the public interest to enable any person to review and criticize their decisions, even though such examination may cause inconvenience or embarrassment. I've always liked that part of Vermont's public record law, and I think just as journalists, that's something that we like to, it's part of what we do, and it's good to be reminded of that every once in a while. So what's public in Vermont's public record law? Anything that's written or recorded information, regardless of how it's recorded, that's produced in the course of a public agency's business. Email that's written by a public official while they're doing their work, that's a public record. A lot of things can be covered in that. So it's, as you can see, it's pretty broad, and there's a lot of things that could be included in that category, which is great for us. Obviously, getting it can sometimes be a little bit tricky. That can be where you run into some trouble. But, really, you can argue that a lot of things here are public record in Vermont. Who can you ask for public records? Pretty much anyone who's doing anything with government work. So any agency, board, department, commission, committee, branch, instrumentality or authority of the state, or any agency, board, committee, department, branch, instrumentality, commission, or authority or political subdivision of the state. Again, that's really pretty broad and covers a lot of ground, which is great news for journalists and also just for citizens. I think sometimes folks forget that anyone can make a public records request. It's not a special law for journalists here to use, but for anyone, any member of the public to use to understand how your government and elected officials work and make decisions. So I think that's a really also important thing to remember. But of course, there's always a lot more, and certainly more things that come up with the law. Agencies can charge for producing those records, for making copies, for the staff time that is associated with collecting those and making those copies, though you get 30 minutes for free, which in my experience rarely can they actually get you the records you want in 30 minutes, but it's nice to have that there. They could also charge you if they provide the records in a non-standard format or they create a new public record. So it's not something that is necessarily that you're going to run into too often, the creating a new public record or the non-standard format, but it's good to know in case one of those things comes your way after you make a public records request. Non-standard format would be, something that I guess is not like a standard, PDF or Excel or Word document, something that's kind of above and beyond a lot of those things, though it's not something that I have run into in my reporting. Another important thing to note is the case Doyle versus Burlington Police Department, which was a Vermont State Supreme Court ruling, which basically said that you can inspect records and not be charged for just inspecting the records. Really, that the state agencies can only charge you for the actual cost of copying and producing those records. It's not the actual inspection that you should be charged for. So one thing you can do when making records requests is simply ask to inspect the record and not ask for copies as well. And when you do that, an agency should just let you look at those records. Oftentimes that would mean coming into their office, which obviously during COVID's been a little bit different, but I think that's a really valuable thing to know, especially if you're not entirely sure what the records you're looking for say, and you're not sure if you were ready to drop a lot of money on them, or maybe you don't have a lot of money, but you still want to see what is going on there. And of course, there are also exemptions. There are a lot. There's too many for me to detail. They're listed in the statute in Vermont, but agencies will often invoke these exemptions when they, if they believe they're not allowed to release something for, or release that part of the record. So I'm not going to go too far into that because I just want to focus on, some really basic records requests that you can make today that will get you some stories and kind of get you moving down the road, I guess. First, here's just an example of my public records request template that I use for every single public records request that I send out. And I have this saved in a Google Drive. And as you can see, I have the spots for date, my name, that's who I'm sending it to, pursuant to 1 VSA 316. I cite the statute, and then what I'm looking for. And later in the presentation, I'll have some examples of how I word my requests, but this is a great template. It's served me well for the years. Important parts are asking if the request is denied that they justify those deletions by reference and cite the exemptions. So that means if I want to appeal it, I can go back to the law and I can look at what they're citing and dispute what they're citing. Basically, it allows me to know why they say I shouldn't get to see something, which is useful in appeal. It's also good to ask for them to release the records to you, even if parts are exempt, instead of withholding. If you ask for just a record that they say, oh, you can't see certain things on it, they might try to withhold the whole document. In this case, I'm specifically asking that if any parts of that record are exempt, that they just redact those parts and send me what is not redacted. I always ask for my fees to be waived. Usually doesn't happen, but I like to ask. Actually, it has happened to me recently, which was great. But also just generally, it's good to ask for them to tell you what the fees are going to be before, so you don't get too surprised by like a $500 or $1,000 or $1,200. I've been given $1,200 bills before, and that's not the greatest thing to bring to your editor. So this is a pretty straightforward request. I'll provide my email afterwards, but I'm more than happy if anyone wants a copy of this template to share it. I think so. Just let me know. I'm always happy to share this. And then one last thing, when I was rereading the law, getting ready for this presentation today, I came across this bit, which I had not remembered, which deals with just saying, the first part in the law says that you can go in on any day other than the weekend or a legal holiday between 9 and noon or 1 and 4 and take a look at the records. And I think that's a really nice thing to remember. And actually, we often think about how we just want to send the public records, we email these things like what I just was showing previously, but we can actually public records are available if you just walk into a town clerk's office and ask to look at them. And I think that's a really powerful and useful tool that journalists have. And obviously the pandemic has made some of that more complicated, but now that things are at least more open, you should be able to go in and take a look at things. So I think that's a really useful thing and goes right into my first records request. The first story that you can get, which is through property records, which might sound a little boring and dry, but property records have a lot of information. You can find out, not just who's owned a place, but if there've been complaints or health violations, especially if you're looking at rental complexes and those sorts of properties. So there can be a wealth of information in these. And I can't show you the exact story that I have that has come from property records because I'm in the process of reporting it. So stay tuned, it'll be out in a couple of weeks. But the way to really go about this reporting, at least that I've been doing it, is I've just call the town clerk and the zoning administrator, whoever is kind of in charge of those things, and you might have to go through a few people to find it. Kind of learn what it is that they call these. I've had some people call they might call it a street file, or they're looking or zoning permits, or whatever it is that they call the big old manila folder they have that tells you things about that property. Find out what you call that and ask for it. And you can ask for that over the phone. I've had success just telling people what I'm looking for and about specific addresses. Like I'm looking for, 45 Main Street in some place in Vermont, and they say, cool, I'll pull that for you. Come on down to the office. And you can sit in the conference room and flip through it and make photocopies if you want. That's kind of the best case scenario. Some places might ask for a formal records request, like the one that I showed earlier today, or earlier in this presentation. And in that case, the conversation that you have with the town clerk beforehand will help you write that request, because you'll know the language to put in so you get what you want. And then just go and spend hours looking through the files that you have, that you've now gotten without having to do a ton of work. And I think going and it's a really valuable thing, like I was saying before, to be able to go in and sit in a town office and go through things and really look at property records to see the stories that are in there. I've been doing some reporting about evictions and housing quality and habitability, and being able to just go into town offices to look at sort of the story of these properties through the records that a town collects has been really valuable, and has led me to find sources that I wouldn't have found otherwise. And so it can be a really good jumping off point too, if you're feeling stuck on a story about, let's say, somebody is getting evicted and they say they've been complaining to their landlord and to the town for a long time, but haven't heard anything. Well, if you go to the property record file, those complaints should be in there. And if they're in there, those will help you not only corroborate what your source is saying about the property, but will also just give you more questions that you can ask to the town officials or to the landlord about why they haven't dealt with the issues that they've been documenting. And so it really gives you a lot more, just more things that you can, more tools in your reporting tool bag, more pieces of information that you can use to make your story better and stronger and just have a lot more impact. So property records, I'm a big proponent of them, and will sing their praises all day. The next one I wanted to talk about is morbid. It's death certificates. And this is the request that I made about almost a little less than a year ago. At the end of 2020, I asked for all the death certificates of people who died from COVID-19 in Vermont. And I think death certificates, I'll talk a little bit more about this specific COVID story, but there's a lot of information in those, including next of kin information, and details about age, just sort of biographical details that if you're unfortunately having to write about somebody who has died, that can help. But also if you're, for example, I've reported on police shootings and people who have been killed by police, being able to try to get in touch with next of kin to understand these individuals who've died. Death certificates are really valuable in sort of helping me start that reporting process. And I think it's something that, at least when I started doing this 6 years ago, I didn't know that death certificates were public. And I think it's something that people might forget about or not realize if it's not sort of brought up. But in this case, with this story that I reported earlier this year, my editor and I wanted to try to reach out to every person in Vermont every family of everybody who had died of COVID-19 in the state. And we did it from March of 2020 to March of 2021, approximately. And so it was around 260 or so people, and the death certificates usually come back as PDFs. And so I would log everybody's name, and we got some other people in our newsroom to help, but I personally reached out to somewhere around 60 or so families, and worked on compiling, of the ones that wanted to talk to me, compiling their stories to try to add a human element to the number that at least we were reporting every day, it seemed like, for a long time during the pandemic, and to try to put not just faces, but stories, and bring some humanity into this pandemic that was just so incredibly difficult for so many people, and took the lives of so many people in Vermont and just around the country. And so this ended up being the one of the main stories that I reported out of it. And I used a lot of sources, a lot of families that I connected with through this reporting. And it was a lot of work, and what we ended up doing was creating everyone that we talked to, we included in kind of like a virtual tribute wall in some way. So I created like little miniature obituaries for all. I think I ended up talking to like 24 or so families, something in that range. And I had colleagues that also did that as well. But the basis of all this reporting was a public record. It was getting the death certificates so I could find these people. And I think often we talk about public records, we're thinking about ways to expose corruption and nefarious things that might be going on. And certainly public records can do a lot to help us find things that are not going correctly. It helps us hold government officials accountable, but they can also be used to tell really human stories. And I think just as journalists, it's worth remembering that we can use them in that way as well. And that is how I ended up using death certificates, was as a kind of groundwork for this much more human and emotional story. So that's one thing to consider, if you're dealing with any sort of obituary or other kinds of stories, those can help you. Or, if you're looking at something like the pandemic and you want to write remembrances of people who have passed away in your community, one way to start looking for them could be in this, if you don't already know them. Another way I've used death certificates is colleagues, we use them to compile all the gun deaths in the state of Vermont, and to create a database, and it's primarily suicides. That's the most gun deaths in Vermont, and it's a way we've been able to track that over time. We usually try to update it every year. I have not updated it this year, but I have the records and in the process of doing that. And that's another way you can do data stories. So thinking about using death certificates to look at opioid overdoses, for example, that's something you can do. We've done it with gun deaths here in the state, and explored sort of the relationship Vermonters have with weapons and regulations as well. So for that, I asked for all death certificates where the cause of death, where it was listed as a gunshot wound, and I got wise this time and asked for it to be in a PDF or in a spreadsheet and not a PDF, because I discovered you could do that, and I got a very long spreadsheet back, so I'll be able to look at that and analyze it, and not have to input it all myself. And so the last thing is police shootings and use of force investigations. And so this doesn't happen a ton in Vermont, but it does happen. And when it does, I think it's important to sort of gather as much as you can about it using the records. Often in this case, I'm making these requests to the Attorney General's office. And so to give a little backstory on this, what I've listed here is the language I used in a request I made. It was actually not after a police shooting, but after an officer up in St. Albans had another newspaper, 7 Days, published a story about of revealing body camera footage of this officer punching a handcuffed woman in the face. And he was fired eventually. And the Attorney General ultimately charged him for simple assault. And so it doesn't happen too often that officers are charged in any sort of excessive force cases. So I became interested in knowing how often the Attorney General here in Vermont reviewed cases of excessive force here in the state. And so I started off by asking for a list of investigations. I asked his office to give me, anytime the Attorney General's looked at shootings, police use of force incidents, and other allegations of misconduct, and I wanted to know when it was opened, who was involved, where it happened, and how it got to the AG's office. I didn't necessarily think that I was going to get in anything beyond that, but it is useful to know just at, if you're writing about, like in this case, I was writing about the officer that was charged. I wanted to know how many times the Attorney General had reviewed similar cases and what decisions he had reached. So that's kind of just that's something you might be like a graph or two, but it's just good information to have if you're reporting on cops in courts and that sort of thing. It's something you'll probably come back to time and time again. This is what I got back. As you can see, it was a spreadsheet with the dates things were opened, who was involved, where it happened, the outcome, and then if it was a shooting or just a use of force incident. And so I looked at this list and I recognized a lot of the names and incidents on here because a lot of them were high profile enough that I already knew about them, or the Attorney General's office put out a press release saying, we decided not to charge these officers in this case because their use of force or the shooting is justified. And so, but there was a name on here that I didn't recognize. I had never heard it before. And that was Corporal Joel Dogrel, and he happened to be in St. Albans, and which was the same place that this other officer had recently just gotten, caught using excessive force. A video of him punching a woman who was handcuffed. It was an incident that happened a year before that, and I thought, I'm curious to know what's going on there. So I made another public records request where I asked for the AG's investigation. I wanted to know what was going on there and what had happened. What happened when the response to them from the AG's office was that they couldn't actually release that record to me because they were reopening the criminal investigation into this police officer, which obviously was surprising to me, and I was not sure what was going on. And I was able eventually to sort of determine that when I asked for the records and they started reviewing them, they told me they found, quote, new information, and that new information led them to believe they needed to reopen the criminal case here. And so come to find out that a year before this other St. Albans police officer was caught using excessive force, another one had quietly been fired and investigated after pepper spraying a man in a holding cell who was also handcuffed. And the Attorney General's office had initially declined to bring any charges in that case. But after I made a public records request about it, they reopened the criminal investigation. And one of the things about this sort of process I'm telling you is I didn't actually get the records in this case, but the sort of asking for records and the kind of chain of records requests, starting with asking just for a list of investigations and then asking about the ones that I wanted to know more about, led to this story, which resulted in the Attorney General reopening this criminal investigation and eventually filing charges. He filed charges last year, and it turned out it was actually a teenager. It was like an 18-year-old that was in the holding cell that was handcuffed and pepper sprayed. And that case is working through the courts right now, and I'm still trying to get my hands on the body camera footage and documents of that. It's been hard to get because of the court case and whatnot. But I think this, to me, is an example too of just thinking about using, asking for lists of investigations. In this case, ask the Attorney General's office. You could ask your local police agency for a list of internal investigations. That can be hard to get, but they should give it to you, and then you can use that just as a jumping off point to find things, to just delve deeper and ask for more documents related to those cases. So that's just sort of a way that you can report using public records, and a way to sort of follow leads and follow your curiosity. So that's mainly what I have. Feel free, you can please email me if you've got questions or want to talk or would like a copy of a records request template, or just I'm always happy to answer more questions.
That was really informative, Liam. Thank you so much for giving us rundown and showing us some of the public requests that you've made. And good luck with your upcoming stories. And thank you for everybody that tuned in. And, we're going to be posting this on NEFAC's YouTube channel. And also be sure to check out the Freedom of Information Guide on NEFAC's website. So again, thanks, Liam, and thanks, everybody.